just going to wait a couple more minutes, people, and we're not waiting for too many people, so we'll be able to get started on time. You'll see that we're recording this, so if you have a problem with that, your computer will let you know that you're welcome to leave, but we hope you don't. Okay, I think we're going to get started. I'll let any latecomers in. Welcome to PHC's Zoom at noon. Today we're going to hear from Jym St. Pierre about the life of Caesar Freeman, a free Black man who lived in Bowdoin, Maine. We've been really fortunate to have some wonderful scholarship about our area's Black residents coming to light lately, and thought that Black History Month was perfect for bringing Jym's research to the fore. We have had several other programs on Black history, and these are all up on our YouTube channel. Just search for Pejepscot History if you'd like to view those. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Museum Services Manager Amy Keithen. I just want to mention a couple more programs we have coming up. On March 9th at noon, also via Zoom, Osher Map Library Executive Director Libby Bischoff will be presenting Art, Education, and Patriotism 19th Century Schoolgirl Maps. And on March 23rd, also at noon via Zoom, historian Corinne Tanzer will be sharing the fascinating history of scrimshaw from folk art to fine art. Both of these programs are part of our 2023 focus, Fine Folk, Critiquing Our Artistic Past, where we hope to shed light on issues surrounding our perceptions of art, including class, gender, and race. More information and registration links can be found on our website. And if you'd like to sign up for event notifications, there's a link at the top of our events page to sign up. A few bits of housekeeping before we start. You're all muted during the talk, except the speaker. Please do not unmute yourself. It's disruptive to the speaker and other attendees. The program is also being recorded, and that would disrupt that as well. We'll have a Q&A portion at the end of Jym's talk, and I encourage you to put your questions in the chat box that is at the bottom in the center, usually, or around the center. And you can just put those in anytime, and then at the end, I'll moderate those for Jym. Some of you might be familiar with Jym St. Pierre. He has curated exhibits on the history of aviation and the town commons for us, as well as given multiple presentations and walking tours around the area. He's also working on another exhibit for us this summer on the anniversary of the mall. He earned BA and master's degrees from the University of Maine and has spent his career working for a number of state agencies and public interest organizations around the state. Since 1995, he's been Maine Director of Restore the North Woods, a conservation group. He's also editor of the Maine Environmental News website, where he has posted more than 100,000 articles. He's currently on Brunswick's Town Commons and Davis Fund committees and the Advisory Council of the Brunswick Topsom Land Trust. And in case you don't think that any of that qualifies him to speak today, it's also worth noting that he was the state champion of Maine Public Television's So You Think You Know Maine series. So with that, I will hand it over to Jym.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Great.
We can hear you.
Greetings to everybody in Zoom land. I can't see all of you, but I see names, some familiar names. Thanks for joining today. beautiful spring day. I just moved a ton of snow out of the driveway. I have a lot to share today, so I'm going to follow my notes pretty closely and show you lots of pictures. And in fact, I'm going to try to screen share. Right now, if I can, how's that? Okay. Well, a couple of things to begin with. First, I want to acknowledge that here in Brunswick, we're on traditional Wabanaki territory. Second, I note that this February marks the 97th anniversary of what we know as Black History Month. And third, I'm always curious to see what happened on a particular date in history. I found that on this day, February 23rd, in 1868, 155 years ago, the great historian and Black civil rights leader, W.E.B. Du Bois, was born. Pretty cool. So recently, while exploring conservation areas in my region, I found myself standing at the shore of Caesar Pond in the little town of Bowdoin, north of Brunswick. Why, I wondered, would a small water in this out-of-the-way spot be named for a Roman emperor? The question led down a maze of intriguing paths. I want to pause here to give a shout out to a few people who've been really helpful. I had a lot of the Caesar Freeman story pieced together a couple of years ago, and then I set it aside. And just in the last month, I discovered that, unknown to me, others were also researching his story. Angela Wheeler of the Bowdoin Historical Society, Eileen Johnson of Bowdoin College, and historian Bob Green have generously shared their research, which greatly helped. There's a deeply rooted narrative about Maine that heroic white guys from Europe poked around here in the 16th century, that in the 17th and 18th centuries, they sent settlers to colonize, that by the 19th century, the English subdued the indigenous people who had been living here for millennia and ousted their French competitors, that wealthy and wannabe rich land speculators acquired vast tracts, and that God-fearing, freedom-loving patriots came and tamed the wilderness. That story is partly true, but it is partly wrong. It obscures a lot of other stories. Instead of being about white stalwarts who came to bring religion to heathens and take from the land what they coveted, this story is about how Black lives mattered, how African-American men and women cultivated the land and carved out a life on the Maine frontier. First, let's back up a little bit. The area that became the town of Bowdoin is virtually landlocked. Wabanaki people probably seldom set foot there during the millennia they traveled the rivers and lakes in the region. When they arrived in earnest and began real estate ventures, European Americans wanted to carve the land into private ownerships. There were conflicting and confusing grants and titles, but in 1752, the Kennebec proprietors conveyed a tract of land which extended from Merrymeeting Bay to the Androscoggin River to William Bowdoin of Boston. William Bowdoin was the son of James Bowdoin, a successful Boston merchant who later served as governor of Massachusetts. William was also the older brother of James Bowdoin, an early benefactor of Bowdoin College. William Bowdoin died in 1773, and while the American colonies fought for independence from Britain, there was little new settlement in Maine. However, by 1779, after the war, James Bowdoin secured legal claim to the area and was granting deeds in West Bowdoinham Plantation. For a couple of years, from 1785 to 1787, he was busy being governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The next year, the town was incorporated by the Massachusetts General Court on March 21, 1788, and named for the Bowdoins. By then, there were about 121 families scratching out a living there. Later, areas were split off to form the present-day towns of Lisbon and Sabatis. Some early settlers in what became the town of Bowdoin obtained deeds from James Bowdoin. Some held so-called Indian deeds, and some were squatters. Until recently, history has tended to focus on the Europeans who settled in New England in the 17th century, the English pilgrims who arrived at what they called Plymouth in 1620, and the Puritans who established the Massachusetts Bay Colony a decade later. But there were many others. For Native Americans, 1620 began a process of coexistence, even cooperation, but it ended in warfare, death from epidemics, and dispossession. The 1619 Project says Black slavery began in North America the year before the Pilgrims, but other sources say it started even earlier. Enslaved Africans were brought by the Spanish in 1526. Others were brought to Roanoke Island in 1586 when Francis Drake plundered them from a Spanish fleet. According to Maine historian Bob Green, the first Black man arrived in Maine as early as 1608, more than a decade before the Plymouth colony. John Winthrop recorded a handful of Africans arrived at the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1638. So long before Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, long before Brunswick was a hotbed of abolitionism, long before Maine had a network of underground railroad lines, it was a place where African slaves, indentured whites, and free Blacks were not uncommon. Black history runs through early Maine. There were slaves, servants, free people, workers, farmers, homeowners, churchgoers. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Bowdoin was mostly a community of dispersed farm families. Today, the town is largely a bedroom community for those who commute to Augusta, Lewiston, Brunswick, and Portland areas. By the early 1770s, tensions between Britain and the American colonies were mounting as Parliament imposed a series of repressive laws. The colonists rose up. On March 5th, 1770, a violent confrontation erupted between soldiers and townspeople. The Boston Massacre left 5 colonists dead. Things got worse. In late 1773, a party of colonists destroyed a cargo of tea in Boston Harbor as a protest. Britain clamped down even harder. On May 20th, 1774, Parliament passed the Massachusetts Government Act, which abrogated the Charter of 1691 for the province of Massachusetts Bay. 6 weeks later, on July 2, 1774, Caesar Freeman and Lydia Freeman recorded in the Ipswich town records their intention to marry. 2 weeks after that, on July 18, 1774, 555 miles to the south, a set of resolutions known as the Fairfax Resolves was adopted at the behest of George Washington and others. The resolutions rejected the intolerable British Parliament's claim of supreme authority over the American colonies. The stage for the American Revolution was being set. That same day, July 18, 1774, Caesar Freeman wed Lydia Freeman in Ipswich, Massachusetts. Records show they were both, quote, free Negroes, unquote. By 1780, the War for Independence was peaking and it was not going well for the colonists. The economy was getting worse. Americans had to surrender 5,000 troops in South Carolina, and turncoat Benedict Arnold tried to give West Point to the British. By December 1780, George Washington's ragtag army was suffering its 6th winter encampment in New York and New Jersey. That may have been when Caesar Freeman decided to sign up. Or did he? First, we need to know more about Caesar Freeman. As we'll see, Caesar Freeman may have become a free man, but many others were not. Between 1619 and 1800, some 400,000 people were forcibly shipped to America from Africa and the Caribbean. That population grew to 4 million by the start of the Civil War. Most were in the South, but Maine had slaves too. Enslaved people from Africa were brought to New England throughout the colonial period. Eventually, some Blacks held the status of freed men, which was somewhere between a white person and an indentured servant. Slaves here were not picking cotton. The books Disowning Slavery and Black Yankees say that slaves worked as bakers, carpenters, shipwrights, sailmakers, printers, tailors, shoemakers, coopers, blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, woodsmen, and goldsmiths. According to a census taken in 1754, there were an estimated 200 Negroes in the province of Maine, including some in Brunswick. A decade later, there were at least 334 Blacks in Maine. This document on the right here records a quote-unquote Negro woman who was being sold as an enslaved person to William Pepperell for 50 shillings. William Pepperell of Kittery was a merchant, military officer, governor of Massachusetts, and the most prolific slave owner in Maine. He bought and sold slaves throughout his life. While slavery was not as widespread in the North as in the South, it was more common in Maine than many people realize. There's limited information about Caesar Freeman. We know that he was born in Ipswich, Massachusetts in the early 1750s. We know he moved to the District of Maine in the late 18th century. A plaque in a church in Bowdoin says he was, quote, one of the last slaves of Massachusetts. And an article in the Portland Press Herald and Lincoln News from 1922 says he was, quote, the last slave freed in Massachusetts. This slave was named Caesar, and when freed, he took the name Freeman, thus becoming Caesar Freeman. Caesar's Pond was named for the one-time slave, unquote. We also know a little about Caesar's wife, Lydia. A book about the early families of the Bowdoin area says that, quote, a Lydia Freeman was born in June 1755. Massachusetts records say a Lydia Freeman was christened on June 28, 1755, and her parents were Peter and Jane Freeman. This small photo on the lower right shows the lot in Ipswich where Lydia Freeman grew up in the late 1700s. From Ipswich to Boston is 100 miles in a straight line, about twice as far by overland trails and rough roads in the late 18th century. But Caesar and Lydia did not come directly here. The record suggests they were living in New Hampshire for a while before moving to Bowdoin. I try to imagine what the area that became Bowdoin was like in the 1780s. It was a forested, hilly land off the beaten track, away from the major travelways by water. It was probably teeming with wildlife and wild plants for the taking. But building a hut, bringing livestock, and carving out a subsistence life would have been a major hardship. The shooting war with Britain had just ended, but the Wabanaki believed this was still their homeland. According to Alan Taylor in Liberty Men and White Indians, quote, wrestling a farm out of the woods had 3 advantages. The cost per acre was comparatively low, the soil, especially after a good burn, was fertile, and the settler could expect a few years of freedom from plant parasites. The disadvantages were numerous: coons, crows, wolves, bears, insects, and a lack of hay for livestock. Living conditions were poor, Half the first homes had no chimneys, most had no beds, and the diet for the first year or two was limited to the point of causing malnutrition. So Alan Taylor writes, why did men and women choose to suffer these conditions? They despised being day laborers or tenant farmers. To be free men, they needed to own their farm. They also wanted to live where their sons could settle near them, unquote. Joshua Millett, in A History of the Baptists in Maine, writes that, quote, the settlement of Bowdoin made its mark in Baptist history as early as the 1780s. About this time, openings in the forest began to appear where the inhabitants were continually removing from the settlements along the rivers to those commenced in the interior. We don't know how Caesar Freeman got land in Bowdoin. We're still trying to figure that out. He might have received it for serving in the military. Records document that his relative, John Freeman of Bath, applied for benefits for his military service. And records show that a man named Caesar Freeman enlisted for military service in Massachusetts when January 1, 1781, for 3 years and served as a private. That Caesar Freeman could have been paid for his military service with a grant of property in Maine, since the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the new United States granted land to reward veterans for service during the Revolutionary War. However, I've searched the online Massachusetts and National Archives databases. I've found no documentation of a land grant to Caesar Freeman in Bowdoin. It seems to me most likely that Caesar Freeman here was not in the Army, that he moved to Maine and acquired title to land in Bowdoin through family connections. His wife, Lydia, had 2 brothers and a sister who had left Massachusetts and were living in Brunswick and Topsham by 1784, the year after the treaty that officially ended the shooting war between the colonists and the Redcoats. It's logical that Lydia and Caesar followed her siblings to Maine, and that Caesar bought land around 1794 in Bowdoin, north of Brunswick, to homestead in a new place, but to be near family. After the American Revolution, many farmers and tradesmen migrated into the District of Maine. The new nation's first census recorded 96,540 residents in Maine in 1790. 538 of whom were non-white, quote unquote, free persons. So how was that possible? In 1781, an enslaved woman called Mumbet brought suit to secure her freedom. Her real name was Elizabeth Freeman, but apparently she was no relation to Caesar Freeman. Her lawyer argued that slavery was illegal because the newly ratified Massachusetts Constitution stated that, quote, all men are born free and equal, unquote. 2 years later, she won her freedom when the court declared in 1783 that the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our conduct and the Commonwealth's Constitution. And other court decisions at the same time also found that slavery was unconstitutional in Massachusetts. In the early 1790s, having won independence from Britain, the American colonies came together to see if they could stick together. To achieve cohesion, many compromises were made in writing a constitution. One of the biggest was apportioning representation in the new US Congress. Most slaves were still property, but each was counted as 3/5 of a person for apportionment. Without the 3/5 clause, the South would have lost 5 votes in the Electoral College, and the North would have gained 7. We know that in the 1780s, Caesar and Lydia Freeman had a growing family. They probably wanted to start fresh, homesteading on their own land. The 1790 census of Bowdoin lists Caesar Freeman as the head of a household of 8 other free persons. At the turn of the century, according to the census of Bowdoin in 1800 and 1810, Caesar Freeman was still head of a household of 9 other free persons. Slaves were counted separately, so the Freemans clearly were free citizens. While we don't know how the Freemans first acquired land in Bowdoin, we do know that on September 4th, 1794, Caesar Freeman and John Freeman bought 180 acres in the town of Bowdoin from Willis Hall. Local lore suggests the land was near the biggest pond in town. This map, dated June 18th, 1794, was created for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It shows the then unnamed pond. John Freeman was probably Caesar's brother-in-law. In 1805, when he was about 25 years old, John sold his share of the Bowdoin tract to Caesar. That same day, Caesar bought out John's interest in the land in Bowdoin, July 27th, 1805. Caesar mortgaged the 180 acres to Benjamin Hesse of Topsham. And in another land deal, in January 1819, Caesar bought 90 acres from Willis Hall for 184 acres, property in Bowdoin on which Caesar Freeman and his family were living. It's challenging to determine Caesar Freeman's descendants from the historical record, but I just received a compendium from Bob Green, a retired journalist and Maine historian. He says he's an 8th generation Black descendant from right here in Cumberland County, and that many of his ancestors were in Brunswick. Indeed, he told me that, quote, about every Black family that can trace their roots to the mid-1800s in Maine has connections with the Freemans, including me, unquote. I'm not going to read all the names in the genealogy that Bob Green has compiled, but I'll show them to you so you can memorize them. For your convenience, I've simplified the list. Here it is. Okay, so maybe some of you didn't memorize the whole list. Here's a graphic that I put together of the first few generations to give you an idea. So Lydia and Caesar gave birth to Adam Freeman. He was born in Massachusetts before they moved to Maine. In 1820, the year Maine became a state, Adam married Nancy Malcolm, who was a white woman. In 1820, the 1820 census listed Adam as head of household in the town of Bowdoin. Adam and Nancy had 7 children. Their son, Moses, married Maria, who was also white, like her mother-in-law. Bowdoin records show that there were half a dozen other Freemans in town. Many may have been the children of Samson Freeman. The relationship between Caesar and Samson is not entirely clear, but their stories overlap so much that they probably were related. You know, Caesar lived before photography, so we have no photo of him. So I'm using this image to represent him. In 1820, the year Maine became a state, the census recorded 2 heads of households named Freeman in the town of Bowdoin, Caesar Freeman and Adam Freeman, though Caesar may have died that year. Some of the Freemans of Bowdoin dispersed to other communities in Maine. Henry and John Freeman went to Newcastle. When Anthony Freeman married Rachel Lee of Bath, they moved to Newcastle. Samuel Freedom is believed to be buried in Brunswick's Houston burying ground. Of the Freemans who lived in Bowdoin, Samson may have moved the most. In 1777, Samson was still living in Massachusetts. He enlisted in the military, apparently, in 1777. By 1790, like Caesar, he was residing in Bowdoin. In 1800, he was living in the Lisbon, Webster, Maine area. In 1820, he was living in Peru, Maine. Samson and his wife, Catherine Freeman, had 4 kids. His second marriage was to the widow of Hosea Foy. When Samson died on March 28, 1843, he was buried in Waterville. Freeman descendants have lived in at least 20 communities in Maine. You can see the list. But many of them stayed in and around the town of Bowdoin. This is the Solomon Eaton House in Bowdoin. According to a bicentennial pictorial history of Bowdoin, quote, "This beautiful home, located near the junction of routes 201 and 125, was over the years the residence of Bowdoin's leading families, including the Freemans." Sadly, the home burned in 1968. So we don't know where Caesar Freeman is, when or where Caesar Freeman died, but some say he was buried in the Hicks Small Cemetery, which is deep in the woods, about 3/4 of a mile east of Caesar Pond. I've found several Freeman family gravestones in that cemetery, but none for Caesar. So I wondered, why the name Caesar? And why Freeman? Well, it turns out classical names were common in 17th and 18th century slave records. There's a historical documentation of chained Africans being dubbed Caesar or Nero or Pluto or Primus or Secundus while they were being shipped to or sold in America. The names of classical heroes were imposed as an ironic insult to their status as chattel slaves. If Caesar as a given name was not unusual, Freeman as a surname was even more common in the United States. Some Freeman lines are Jewish, descended from the Germanic Friedman or Friedman. Others are Anglo descendants of 3 English immigrants who arrived in the early 17th century. And still others are African American, especially many who were Blacks who adopted the surname after emancipation in 1863. But none of those apply to Caesar Freeman of Bowdoin, Maine. He was not a Germanic Jew, nor is there evidence that he had any connection to the English immigrants Samuel, Edmund, or Ralph Freeman, unless he was the property of someone in their families before he was freed. And Caesar Freeman of Bowdoin, Maine was free Black man in the 17th century, decades before Emancipation Proclamation. So I think the preponderance of evidence suggests that Caesar Freeman likely was a slave in Massachusetts, that he acquired his name as a slave, that he secured his freedom probably from an owner rather than by military service or by a change in the law or court order, that he was a free Black man living in colonial Massachusetts, that he married, moved to New Hampshire, then to Bowdoin in the District of Maine to start fresh in the 1780s, homesteading with his wife Lydia and the first of their children. What we do know is that Caesar Freeman was an early member of the First Baptist Church in Bowdoin, which was organized in 1788, and that he was so respected that he even had a nameplate on a pew in the church. If Caesar was not an unusual name and Freeman was a common name, the combination of the two names was surprisingly ordinary. You can see from this list that I got from the historical records, many people named Caesar Freeman showed up. All of them could not be the same person that we're talking about here today. There's even a curious story about a slave named Freeman Caesar, who was brought from Boston to New Hampshire. At some point, when that man with the reverse names was freed, he lived on a mountain there, which became known as Caesar's Mountain and then Mount Caesar. It seems unlikely that any of these Caesar Freemans were the same man who settled in Bowdoin, Maine. Well, obviously it's beyond this presentation to tell the stories of all of Caesar Freeman's descendants, but I can mention a couple with the Brunswick connection. Adam Freeman was born in 1782, as I mentioned, in Massachusetts. He was the son of Caesar and Lydia Freeman. Adam moved to Bowdoin with his parents. In 1820, he married Nancy Malcolm. Before he died in 1873, at the age of 91, Adam and Nancy Freeman had more than half a dozen children. All were listed in the 1850 US Census as mulatto. One of Adam and Nancy's kids was Charles D. Freeman, who became a farmer in Brunswick. One hot July day in 1882, fire broke out in Charles Freeman's barn just east of Pine Grove Cemetery. The barn and the house were lost. Today, Varney Cemetery is the site of the former Freeman farm. Charles and Mary, several of their children, and Charles's parents, Adam and Nancy, are buried in that cemetery. You can see a photo here I took of the family grave monument just a couple of days ago. These stories about members of the Freeman family are not unusual for the times. According to the book Maine's Visible Black History, the Black population in Brunswick peaked in 1850 at 119 people. Combined with nearby Bath, the Black population totaled 220 that year, second in Maine only to Portland. Barbara Damaris and Kate McBrien have written, quote, "The Freeman family's experiences reflect the general experience of Bath Brunswick society. The Freemans married, divorced, worked for the railroad as domestics or at Bowdoin College, and fought in the Civil War. As with other Maine families, some descendants left Maine to seek better opportunities. Through successive generations, some of those who remained in Maine eventually lost the outward appearance that connected them to their African ancestors. Some families were listed as Negro in one generation, mulatto in the next, and white in subsequent generations," unquote. So what about Caesar Pond? This is where my curiosity about Caesar Freeman started. Precisely where Caesar Freeman's house was located isn't certain. I've not found his name on any of the maps of Bowdoin, including this 1858 map, which listed most of the homeowners. However, according to the book, Early Families of Bowdoin, it was, quote, more likely than not that he had lived near or what has been known as Caesar's Pond in Bowdoin. So Eileen Johnson manages the environmental studies program at Bowdoin College. She's also a map expert who lives in the town of Bowdoin. She's researched the Freeman family and is preparing a presentation on mapping where they likely lived and on women's property rights in the 19th century. This map she prepared shows the general location of the Caesar Freeman homestead. The pond itself was unnamed on the 1794 map of the area. It remained unnamed on the 1858 map of Saginaw County. The pond finally got its official name in 1881 when George Varney published his Gazetteer of the state of Maine. Varney would have asked locals what it was called, and the U.S. Geological Survey continued the name Caesar Pond when it published the first topographic map of the area in 1892. Different sources say that Caesar Pond is of various sizes. I've seen numbers ranging from 51 acres to 60 acres to 75 acres. Maybe it depends on the time of year, how much water there is. However, all the sources agree the pond is shallow, only about 8 feet at its deepest, and has a limited warm water fishery. A Maine Fish and Game document said that the pond was surveyed in 1954. The next year, the department experimented with the introduction of largemouth bass, but most of the fish died out. Another survey in 1963 reported that, quote, biologists were unable to establish the presence of any fish. No further stocking should be made, unquote. Well, despite the lack of stocking by the state, today the pond remains popular with local anglers who report catching largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted bass. Probably they were illegally stocked by bait bucket anglers. So while it may not be a trophy trout water, Caesar Pond and the surrounding area offers terrific wildlife habitat. In 1988, 539 acres were acquired by the Fish and Wildlife Department to create the Caesar Pond Wildlife Management Area. In 2006, an additional 106 acres of land were acquired when the town of Bowdoin donated a foreclosed piece of property to the state. According to the Maine Fish and Wildlife Department, Caesar Pond Wildlife Management Area provides good habitat for many wetland and upland species. This is said to be a grist mill at the outlet of Caesar's Pond, built around 1815, while Caesar Freeman would have still been alive. Caesar Pond is the site of both natural history and human history. As we learn more about Maine's Black history, I'd like to see the state put up an interpretive sign at the pond, briefly telling the Caesar Freeman story. So a final thought. At a time when some politicians in our country are blocking teaching the true history of slavery and discrimination and race riots, when there is controversy over whether Black lives matter, when racial profiling by police sometimes turns deadly, when woke has become a 4-letter word, though it basically means paying attention, it's important to know there have been times when people got along and prospered. History matters. Maine has a history of prominent Black men and women. We also still have unresolved issues of racism, as articles in this week's newspapers show. But there's progress. In the Maine legislature last month, the first Black Speaker of the House was elected. And just this morning, there was an article in the Portland paper about the hiring of the first racial equity director. So Caesar Freeman may not have been a soldier in the American Revolution, but I think he was a revolutionary, a free man in an era of slavery, a man of faith at a time when it was easy to lose faith, a family builder during an era of chaotic nation building, a community leader living on the front line of intense international warfare and high racial conflict. I think Caesar Freeman's story deserves to be told. Thank you. A lot of people helped, so I'm going to show you a list of some of the people who really helped in and some of the sources that I used in putting the presentation together. So I think, Amy, if there are any questions, I can try.
Thank you, Jim. That was amazing. That was really well done. And we do have comments already that are saying that you're an excellent researcher and presenter. And one comment I'm going to read directly to you. Thank you for this presentation. As a white person born in Topsom and educated at Mount Ararat, I'm glad to learn about the Freeman family, Caesar Pond, and that some freed persons were able to settle here. I also view as important the acknowledgement that some areas of Maine benefited from chattel slavery. I strongly hope that this and similar information will be taught at Mount Ararat and other schools throughout Maine. So I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of the reasons that this story needs to be told. Does anybody have any questions? Please just put them in the chat box. We'd love to stump Jim as the So You Think You Know Maine champion. I actually had a quick question, and it might be a nothing question, but you mentioned that the Freeman monument that you found was in the Varney Cemetery, and then you mentioned that the first map that Caesar Pond was named on was produced by a Varney. Is there any connection there between the Varney families and the Freemans?
Boy, you stumped me.
Oh yeah. No.
I don't think so. I don't think so, but you know, that's another research project.
Yep, certainly. Yeah. What was your favorite part of researching this story, or your favorite finding?
Well, I think just it's a learning experience for me. I mean, there's a lot of information that's been coming out in recent years about Black history in Maine, and I hope it gets taught in the schools and much more widely. You know, it's a really not well known, but very important part of the story. I've been doing some personal genealogy in the last couple of years and discovered amazing things, that I have ancestors that go back to 5 centuries ago in old England and in the Middle East. And I just think history matters. Angela Wheeler said to me yesterday, history is a mystery. History is a mystery, but we can uncover a lot of these mysteries by looking, by opening our eyes. There's an enormous amount of information now that's being uncovered both in the archives and in the soil by archaeological work that's being done. And some of the work that I mentioned, Eileen Johnson has been doing to map where the Freemans lived in the town of Bowdoin. I think she'll be able to share more of that information in the future. I think I'm always fascinated by where did people live? What was their lives like? What was Freeman Caesar's life like in the year 1800 in the town of Bowdoin when you had a big snowstorm like we're having today? How did they deal with that? They didn't get the snowblower out like I did. Um, so I just find it fascinating to learn about other people's lives.
Mm. Um, Someone has asked if you found any connections to the town of Harpswell and Bailey Island, where the Freeman family also lived for quite a few generations.
Um, I maybe somebody memorized that list of descendants that I scrolled through. Um, I think there were some Harpswell connections there. The I can't tell you the names off the top of my head, but there, as I tried to show with one of the maps, um, Caesar Freeman, Caesar and Lydia Freeman's descendants lived in many towns in Maine, and a lot of them are in the Brunswick, Topsham, Lisbon, Harpswell, Newcastle area, and in Portland, a lot of the towns around the Portland area. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some deep Harpswell roots as well.
Um, Interestingly, I think we knew that there would be some Freeman ancestors on this call, which is wonderful. And Stephen says, my uncle was the last Freeman owner of the large Freeman homestead in Bowdoin, and he spent many years there, or hours there when he was young. So that's really wonderful to hear that that connection that you were talking about into today is alive and kicking.
Yeah, I was hoping
Another,
there would.
yeah,
I
go
was
ahead.
hoping there would be some family members that would be here today, and maybe they either now or later can, even provide some more information to fill in more of the story.
Um, Another question, do you have any information on how free Blacks were treated by the white population in Maine in the 18th and 19th centuries?
I don't have specific information, but I think, there are some of the research that's been published in recent years suggest that it was sort of the full spectrum, that some people were not treated well, some people were treated better than others, and essentially some were indentured servants, which was not called slavery, but it certainly wasn't the same as being a free person. But some of them um, were completely independent, free people who were just like, as I said at the end, Caesar Freeman was a very important, well-respected member of his community and his church community. Uh, so I think it was the whole spectrum.
Um, do you, did any of the census records that you were looking at list occupations for any of the Freeman family members, that we might know what they were doing when they settled?
I think a lot of the occupation had to do with farming, um, both in the town of Bowdoin and in Brunswick. I mentioned a few examples of that. Some of the other stories that I found in the 1800s, a number of the Freeman descendants worked for the railroad. The railroads were coming into this part of the state. So it would have been not uncommon for people to get work, various jobs in the railroad. Some of them worked at Bowdoin College, sort of bringing it full circle from what I talked about at the beginning, from how William and James Bowdoin acquired title to the land in what became the town of Bowdoin. So I think, the people, the Freeman family descendants who were living in Maine and in particular in this area were just like anybody else. They were just doing all the same, living the same kinds of lives, trying to get by, doing the same kinds of work as a lot of other people. It wasn't that uncommon. They weren't picking cotton. This was not the South. It was different. But, it's important, as I said, that we know our history, and that part of Maine's history that hasn't been well known until recently is that there were enslaved people here. It seems just it's part of the whole story.
I just got a message from some more descendants saying that, well, first of all, very much enjoyed the presentation, and that 5 of their children are direct descendants from Lydia and Caesar through Anthony Freeman, which is, it's just wonderful to have you all here today, and to know that's that modern connection. And I'll make sure that Jim gets this more detailed information as well.
That's great. Thank you.
I think we might have time for one more question. If anyone has any last questions, pop them in the chat box. I don't see if something comes in, I'll share it. Oh, okay, one more. Are there any Baptist church records to help fill in the history?
Angela needs to answer that question. Do you have any information, Angela?
I have some information about Samson Freeman. He was after he moved from Bowdoin to Peru, he was a founder in one of the Baptist churches in that area. But as far as Bowdoin goes, I don't have a lot of information about the Freemans being directly involved in the church. I'm also just writing a little chat, which I can just speak it instead, that if anybody would like to further this conversation with the Bowdoin Historical Society at some point, you can feel free to find us on the web, which is Bowdoin Historical Society. And we also have a Facebook page.
We thank you very much too for anyone who's part of the Bowdoin Historical Society or the Bowdoin-Hams Historical Society. We're really happy to have you joining us today as well. It's a little bit out of our normal area, and it's really nice to make that connection. And hopefully we'll be able to do a little more together in the future. So this is just the beginning, I think, is one of the things that we've learned from this, along with how relevant it is. So keep your eye out for other presentations and research. We'll certainly be sharing that on our social media, anything that's relevant. If you signed up for today, then you'll be getting a link to the recording of this. And then we'll also be putting the link on our YouTube channel and on our website sometime within the next few weeks. So with that, I think I'm going to thank Jim very much for doing this presentation for us. And we'll end this and hope to see you at a future presentation. The next one coming up is March 9th, and that is Libby Bischoff presenting about schoolgirl maps in the 19th century. Thank you all so much for your support of PHC, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.